morning, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Hot Topics. It's really great to have you joining us. My name is Ilse, and tonight I'll be hosting along with my co-host, Clonnie, and we've got some exciting guests that are joining us for tonight's conversation. So just before we get into the topic, we want to just introduce our guests and allow them an opportunity to introduce themselves to you. So, ladies first, Christine, we'll start with you.
Hi, I'm Dr. Christine Aidle. I am a clinical psychologist by training, and I spend most of my time at the University of South Africa as a senior lecturer. And I see clients in part-time private practice, and I train students to be psychologists.
Thanks so much, Christine. We're really excited to have you joining us.
Thank you.
And then we've got Phezile Kuku as well.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Phezile Kuku. I'm an ordained minister in the Methodist Church of Southern Africa. It's been 12 years since the church has given me a space to offer and respond to God's calling. I've served in different congregations in different contexts. I have been in traditional township congregation in Soweto. I've been also in Durban, where I've served in a traditional, previously white congregation at Durban North Methodist Church, and then came back to serve at West Rand area, where I served Beggarstyle community, which is mainly a mining community, also a community that is partly semi-informal settlement, very densely populated community with so many challenges. I've moved from West Rand to Gracepoint, where I served for 2 years. I'm not sure, maybe it's a middle-class community, but it's a very modern congregation. Currently, I'm serving at Diepsloot. It's an informal settlement community with so many challenges ranging from unemployment, drugs and substance abuse, overpopulated community. I'm excited to be here tonight to engage and share my thoughts and ideas. Thank you.
Thanks, Vasile. We're just as excited to have you on here as well. So tonight's topic actually wraps up our My Church or Your Church series. We've been speaking about the differences in churches, different expressions of worship, and our topic for tonight, we look at the church on the wrong side of history again. How do we as a church find ourselves, or how have we found ourselves on the wrong side of history? And I think there are countless examples that we can look at both within our country but also throughout the world in our history of how as a church we found ourselves on the wrong side of history. But also now, how do we look in our contemporary modern day context of how do we find ourselves on the wrong side of history, and how do we position ourselves to be on the right side of history? So maybe as a first question to start us off with tonight, we can look at how we have found the church on the wrong side of history. And Christine, maybe from your side as well as a psychologist, you can tell us, what is it about humans that helps or almost enables us in a sense to, or causes us to find ourselves on the wrong side of history? So in our context in South Africa, we've had instances such as apartheid, where as a church, and I don't mean necessarily the Methodist Church only, but as a church corporately, we find ourselves sometimes being or benefiting either from the oppression, or we find ourselves working alongside the oppressor instead of in the margins with the marginalized and speaking up against the oppressor. So what is it about our human condition that causes us to oppress others, causes us to be scared to stand up? What is it about that? And how have we as a church found ourselves on the wrong side of history?
It's quite complex, but I think what stands out for me is that we all have needs as human beings. And one of the needs that we don't like to admit is the need to be in power. And people need to be noticed, and that power can be misused. And the church is powerful by virtue of the fact that it's exposure of a number of people to other people. And also the church is an institution, or it's been institutionalized. And then, of course, individuals within that system use their power and their influence in ways that are negative towards others. And sometimes our needs are met by oppressing other people. People feel better about themselves at the expense of other people. So it's a kind of a drive for power. It's a narcissistic need, so it's selfish, it's egocentric. In other words, it's just about you. And that can be contagious in contexts where another person might have dependency needs. So they might depend on somebody else to define what they understand. So it sets up a kind of power dynamic. So you've got this thing where somebody is power hungry, and then you've got somebody that is dependent, so that will be overly influenced. And so it's difficult because you're not only dealing with one type of person, you're dealing with many different country needs. And if somebody is misusing their power, they can take advantage of somebody in need and use it for their benefit. And what happens is it sets up triangles between the persecutor and the persecuted and a bystander. And we see that in South Africa. A lot of people will say, but I didn't persecute someone, but they were on the sideline, which in itself is a place of lack of accountability. So it's quite difficult. It's not one or the other, but it can set up a whole kind of different power dynamics. So that's the first thing that comes to mind, is that systems have many different positions. And that's why it can be quite scary. Yeah.
Thank you. I think for me, from the introduction of the church in South Africa itself, how it was introduced to Africans, the church, it was on the wrong side. Because those who came to introduce the church, the missionaries, came with an idea that these people don't have faith, don't believe. These people are uncivilized. These people are lesser human beings than us. These people, we are here to give them something. They were not coming with an intention to say, we're here to introduce Christ. But when they came to introduce the church, it had also colonial traits in it, the introduction.
Yeah.
So everything that was not Christianity, according to their standards, that was uncivilized. For example, cultural beliefs, cultural practices, cultural customs, all those things, they were perceived to be unchristian. So coming to Africa, introducing the church from the onset, it came with the wrong perception to say we are coming to people who are uncivilized. We want to civilize them. And as they were coming here, they were coming with Eurocentric mentality that this is who Christ is in America, then who Christ should be for Africans. You move to also, when they were doing this, they used Bible to justify that. They used Bible to advance their ideologies, which were seeking to dehumanize Africans. Then you proceed to the era of apartheid. When apartheid was introduced, the church was on the side of the oppressor. And the church was the one who was used to advance the apartheid policies. There were people who were saying, this is biblical. This is God who says there should be a nation that is chosen. And white people were the chosen nation. And they were chosen to oppress black people. And it was the church that was on the side of the oppressor. You come to democracy even now. Those people that are sitting in parliament, those people who are corrupt, those people who are leading in the society, they sit in our pews every Sunday. They are members of our congregations. They are preachers, they are leaders in our congregations. But when they leave the doors of the church on Sunday, they live differently. And they join the other side. So as the church now, we become on the other side that is wrong.
Sure. Thank you so much, Christine and Phezile. So one thing I've always seen, so for instance, whenever we speak about the church being on the wrong side of history, examples that would come up are examples like what else is already mentioned, colonialism, apartheid, we also have the Holocaust, And so we go on and on and on. But what you find is that the church would say, like for instance, when I chat to Christians from Germany, they would pride themselves in the fact that they've had a system that has really helped them get around the Holocaust, and they now do things differently. When you speak to the church in South Africa, when we speak about, for instance, things like the Bel Air Confession, would be so proud to say, no, we've had a turnaround strategy. When you speak in the Methodist Church, we'd speak about Obedience 81 and Journey to the New Land and say we've had a turnaround strategy. But the irony that you find is that when you look at situations, for instance, one, the Holocaust, you find that through people like Theo Hatzog, who then went on to say, okay, fine, let us find a Jewish homeland as a solution to the anti-Semitism that was taking place against the Jewish community. But you find that there are still young people who would go on to problematize the church and say, the solution that you were a part of and the solution that you continue to support to this day is a solution that has left other people marginalized yet again, and those are the occupied Palestinian territories, regardless of where we are around the issue. You'd find young people who would then go on to say, in your solution around apartheid, you have only engaged apartheid, but you have not engaged colonialism. We still see colonial traits in how we do church, from the stole that the minister wears and so on, we would go on. And then you'd have people that would go on to say, in your issues around apartheid, the church has not really repented. You still have people who perpetuate corruption sitting in the pews of the church, as you've mentioned. And it seems like there's just this subtle rule within the church from history that one minister describes as, thou shalt sin, but not be seen. As long as you've taken away the evidence of the sin and you're not seen, it's okay. How do we deal with this? Because it seems like these power dynamics are just so complicated.
For me, it brings back the question, well, what is church? If an individual is saying church is a Sunday event that I go to, and it's ritual, and it's what I do on a Sunday, and yes, I have a relationship with God, but it doesn't change necessarily the way that I relate to all individuals, then of course there's a hypocrisy there. And I think for me, that's the question about when you say church is on the wrong side of history, we could go right down to say, well, it's Christians together corporately that have decided that their value system is skewed. So we have to go back to the original premise of what does Christ say about a changed heart? And so it goes right to the core of who you are as a person. If your values are not speaking to your actions, then you can agree to be part of oppressive systems. And when you were speaking, I thought about this idea of a church persona. It's a kind of mask I put on. I'm a law-abiding citizen of the country. I go to church on Sunday to do the right things and the right rituals. I baptize my children, and but it's not a core change of how I see people. And I think until we go back to the core of what Christ calls us into conversion, which is that every single individual, regardless of their politics, regardless of their sexuality, regardless of their socioeconomic status, regardless of all of that, everybody's of intrinsic worth. Until that defines what church is, church can just be a form of behavior. It's not necessarily goes to the core value system of a person. So I think it goes to your intrinsic values for me. So I can understand how divorced it can look. The person does this on a Sunday, but then on Monday they're busy supporting oppressive systems. I mean, literally, you'd have to divorce yourself. As let's take apartheid. You divorce yourself. You hear one thing, and then you read another thing in the Bible, but on Monday you're oppressing the very person. So I think it's about disconnects. People disconnect different parts of themselves. Yeah.
So for me, the challenge that we're having with the institutional church throughout the history. It will always continue to make errors because those who are in leadership are human beings. They are deemed to have errors, human errors. But that does not justify that the church should always be on the wrong side. What's happening now, for example, as you put it rightly, what is it? What is the church? For me, the church, it is when Jesus Christ is asked about what's the greatest commandment. Love your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and loving your neighbor as you love yourself. That for me is the definition of the church. And that loving God should be the premise of the church, that if we are a church, then we are to be spiritually formed, spiritually renewed, and spiritually matured. That spiritual formation and spiritual maturity should go beyond Sunday. It should be translated into actions on our daily living when we leave the institutional church on a Sunday. What's happening now, the church, throughout centuries and throughout decades and throughout many times, the church is divided because it does not have authority to speak in one voice, because of doctrinal differences, because of differences in terms of ethos. And those differences, they influence how we do church.
Absolutely. I think of, by you speaking, I start thinking about a time in the Bible. We can read it. I think it's Matthew 21, verse 12. We read about Jesus, where he goes into the temple. And even in the temple, there is, corruption, and where people have turned this, what's supposed to be beautiful and sacred, which was their temple or the synagogue, and they would then go over and they would turn it into a marketplace. And how Jesus responds to that by throwing over the tables and saying, this isn't how it's supposed to be. And I wonder if there's something for us to learn from that example of, and so many other instances where we see how Jesus didn't just stand on the sidelines and watch oppression happen. He didn't see things happening and say, well, I'm not the one doing it. I don't need to do anything about it. How do we apply this model of Jesus, and can we apply? Is there such a thing as the model that Jesus adopts about justice and power? And what do we, as the church, not just as the institution, but also as the people, what do we need to overcome in order to truly apply the model that Jesus left for us?
So for me, recently, we saw last week throughout the country, around the issue recently about cliques and the economic freedom fighters protesting, there was violence involved. There are different views about that. And someone asked me, what's your views on that? And I said, sometimes oppressors, they listen to violence. Active resistance can lead to liberation. The example that you are putting right now about Jesus in the temple. If Jesus could have walked into the temple and said to people, stop selling here in the church, stop doing this, do you think people are going to listen to him? So passive resistance, sometimes it doesn't help. For us to be true with our call as the church, we need an active resistance. And active resistance, it is radical in its nature. And it is costly in its nature. Sometimes as the church, we want to act justly. We want to do justice. But our fear, it is to lose people. Our fear, it is to lose money. Our fear, it is to lose membership. Our fear, it is to lose popularity. Our fear, it is to lose our stance and support from the community. But sometimes you have to lose for you to gain. Justice can never happen unless we are radical and intentional if we want to be a just church.
What stands out for me, and I think the points raised are very valid, because a lot of what drives institutional oppression is actually economics. And that's a very uncomfortable subject because it's always behind the scenes. And a lot of money and politics are driving these decisions of oppression for power. And so I think the temple example is a very good example where people are driven by money and economics. And they frame it in many pretty ways that no one actually picks up that it's about money and enrichment. And I think a lot of the situation that we are facing in South Africa and worldwide is, well, where is the money? And that explains a lot of the decisions that are made in governments across the world and are made in the world economy. And that's why it's not people who are taking responsibility and accountability to say that a lot of people that are oppressed, it's around poverty. And I think, obviously it's not the only reason, but I think the legal frameworks and economic frameworks that determine or intersect a lot with the problems that the church is facing. And I think we shouldn't divorce these things. I think there are economic reasons why things happen. And then other things get laid on it. And I think as a church, as individuals, as Christians, we need to say it's got a complex nature to it. And I think the church mustn't be afraid to also look at the economics of the oppression.
You're so spot on, Christine. And I actually want to combine what you said with what Paisley just spoke about. One of the reality is that there were consequences to the decisions that Jesus made. And the greatest consequence was actually the cross. But before we even get to that moment of the cross, he actually says to his disciples that if you guys want to follow me, you have to be ready for what comes with following me, because he understood that sailing against the flow of the river comes at a great cost. Working against an existing and powerful system comes at a great cost. He worked against two systems, the Roman and what the Jews would have desired to be the outcome of his presence. Now, the point I'm trying to get to is what you spoke about. Is there a sense in which we could say, when we speak against injustice, when we as the church try to be on the right side of history as far as justice is concerned, that it comes at the cost of church growth? I'll say, for instance, one, we look at how churches that give a theology that says, that affirms people's unjust actions, injustices, that affirms their injustices, those churches seem to be growing. Those are churches that have all the numbers. And yet the churches that speak out against injustice are the churches that are losing all the congregation members. And then Christine speaks about the power of economics. And it is also evident, we've seen it throughout church history, that people not only vote against the church's stance, people do not only vote against unpopular church stance with their feet, but they also vote with their wallets. And so churches are almost forced to stand in this place where they agree with everything that is happening against them so that they can grow and that they can be in a good place economically. What is your stance? How do we maintain this tension between our desires to be in a good place economically as a church and our desire to grow our congregation as a church?
For me, when you mention church, I think the hardest thing for me to always remember is the churches. When I think of church, you obviously think of a building, and I have to remind myself it's not. And I think if we go back to the original church, it was disciples. And the disciples, if we go to the first 12, they were unpopular. And they were a minority. So if we're looking for big churches where people come and they agree with everything and you'd never challenge anything, then we're basically just promoting entertainment. It's called church, but it's not radical at all. It doesn't challenge anything. It just feeds the most popular view. And that's just enriching whoever wants to be enriched. So for me, if a church is struggling, if a church is challenging, if a church is unpopular, for me, that's more accurate to the original, not always, but there's more likelihood that they're adhering to the original prototype of the church, which is we are not popular, we are sidelined, marginalized. So in actual fact, we're in good company if we are marginalized, because that was the original church. The original church of when Christ was on earth was unpopular. It was persecuted by definition. So this idea that it's supposed to bring lots of people, that would be wonderful. But to follow Christ is a sacrifice. And it makes people uncomfortable. So I agree that there's a challenge for us to say, well, it's going to be difficult. And by virtue of becoming a Christian, you have to lose everything else. And that's a hard, hard reality.
So for me, what I've observed recently in our country, churches now are popping up like popcorns. Everyone is starting a new church. Simply because we have diverted from the authenticity of what church is. At the heart of the gospel of Christ, the church should always be on the side of the marginalized. The church should always be on the side of those who are in the periphery. The church should always be on the side of those who are oppressed. At the heart of the gospel, it is social justice. That's what defines the ministry of Christ. Jesus Christ spent most of his time pursuing justice for all. Throughout his ministry, Jesus Christ, he was after and seeking and longing for justice for all. And that longing and yearning led him to the cross. So now what's happening? For us to say, if we don't speak truth to the power, we don't confront social injustices, economic injustices, racial injustices, any forms of injustices as the church, because we are afraid that that will compromise our economic muscle as the church, then it means now we are no longer the true church of Christ. We have lost the essence and the nature of the church, of being the church. Now what's happening, what I'm observing with the church, not mentioning only the Methodist Church, any church, is thus, we are struggling to find authority to be on the right side because we ourselves were standing in the shaky ground. We have become the fountain of injustice. Injustice, it is where the churches have become now the playground of injustice. Issues of gender-based violence, they happen in the church, they are put under the carpet. Issues of sexuality, our church is almost 25 years now not taking a stance about same-sex relationship and marriages. Then how do you have authority to speak against those who are oppressing gays and lesbians when you yourself don't have a stance? When you stand in a shaky ground, you will not have an authority to confront social injustices. Until your ground is solid, then you will have authority to speak and confront any forms of injustices.
So we're basically silencing ourselves because of the things that we do, because of what we do against women, because of how we're treating the community and not having a clear stance on same-sex marriages. We're basically disempowering ourselves as the church.
So what's happening, I'll speak about my own church. My own church, Methodist Church, it's policy-orientated church. All those policies are not translated into actions. There are policies around gender-based violence in the church, but many women are oppressed daily in the church. I can count how many women who can say, I've reported my case, and this is the outcomes of the case. So for us to be able to have authority, to be on the right side and move from the wrong side, we need, when I was at seminar, I think it's Dr. Ross Olifiru once told us, the late Dr. Alex Borain, who was the president of the Methodist Church in 1971, they had a delegation that went to the president of the country as the Methodist Church leadership to talk about the injustices that were happening in the country of apartheid, how racial segregation, how apartheid was dehumanizing black people, and how as the church they are saying this should come to an end. And then the president of the country said, but you in the Methodist Church, black ministers are getting lesser salaries, remunerations than white ministers. You've got divided synods, you've got divided conferences. How do you have an authority to come and confront the country's social injustice and racial injustices? So our shaky ground compromises our stance to speak and confront injustices.
Absolutely. So, both of you, and I don't want to lose the essence of what you've just said, but I do want to come back just a little bit before that. Both of you spoke about the fact that if we are to really confront injustice and not participate in oppression, we need to find ourselves in the margins with those that are in the margins. And Christine, you spoke specifically, you used the words, we need to find ourselves on the sidelines. And I just thought about how the biblical teachings even tell us about how it will be if one is prophetic, how the prophet is always rejected by their own, how we won't be popular, and so maybe my question is, how do we as a church align ourselves or find ourselves? What do we as both the church as an institution and as the people, what do we need to do in order to make sure that we find ourselves the voice in the darkness, prophetic, that we are not participating in it, but that we are speaking up against it?
For me, I think the hardest thing is to take a public stance. And I think the only way that, psychologically speaking, the only way that I've found that one can take a very strong stance of being rejected publicly or being frowned upon is how you feel inside as a person, how you as an individual feel about yourself and your relationship with God. So inner spirituality, your inner relationship with God determines what you're capable doing in terms of action and social justice. So to divorce social justice from an inner journey with God creates problems for us because it's incredibly difficult to stand against injustice, especially if you historically or even currently have vested interests in not offending anyone. Because the people you could be offending are people that you love, or situations that you benefit from. Right? I mean, injustice doesn't happen outside of our lives. It happens in our lives, in our homes. So the cost is incredibly high. And the only way to stand up against something is to have an inner relationship with God. So I'm always encouraged by writers and Christians that link the two, that say your ability to do social justice is related to your personal relationship with God. So your inner contemplation enables you to effectively survive the onslaught of the rejection or people making your life, because you're human. The idea of somebody being offended with you or hurting you in the process or making your life difficult can make you not want to do this anymore. So I just want to say I do think it's linked to an inner relationship, prayerful relationship with God.
So, for me, what I'm listening and hearing from you, we cannot divorce spirituality from psychology, economics, politics.
Yeah.
And that is affirmed by our understanding that the ministry of Jesus Christ was holistic. Jesus Christ, matters of politics, he attended to them. The politics of the Rome, he attended to them. Social issues, he attended to them. Economic issues, he attended to them. Spiritual issues, he attended to them. Now, therefore, we cannot divorce the church from the society, because the church is made up by people who are coming from the society, and the society is made up by people who are coming from the church. The two cannot be divorced. Now, I think for me, one of the Black liberation theologians, James Cone, he says he struggled to understand why Reinhold, who's a white theologian in America, in his book, The Cross the cross, James Cone writes. He says in his book that Reinhold failed to make analogy between the assassination of black people and the crucifixion of Christ in America. For many years, black people were assassinated in America. And Reinhold could write a theology that was a theology of salvation of Christ in the cross and all that theology. He says there's nothing wrong with that. But Reinhold failed to write about assassination of black people and makes analogy of that assassination and the crucifixion of Christ. Both black people and Jesus Christ, they died for justice. So for me, I think it is high time for the church to allow itself to be crucified. Be it crucified economically, be it crucified numerically, for it to be able to have solid ground and authority to speak about justice issues and be on the right side. Let it be crucified and die. After resurrection, it is then the church will be able to be true in its nature and essence of being the church of Christ.
You're making me want to preach. The first thing that comes into mind when Paisley speaks about this is the statement that Jesus makes after he has turned tables upside down. And he says, crucify. He says, destroy this temple. And after 3 days, it will be resurrected. It's something along those lines. But even if you're to destroy this temple, after 3 days, it will be built again. But now moving forward, I can imagine someone is sitting at home thinking to themselves, oh man, you guys are speaking so intelligently around this. And I'm struggling with this on a day-to-day basis. I remember one of my favorite radio hosts once said, the beauty of middle-class tables is that they can philosophize poverty because it's not a day-to-day experience. And so we come with all these intellectual debates and arguments around poverty, whereas those who are truly facing poverty have to have a plan right now as to where they're getting their meal from. We could say the same about these issues. There are people who are experiencing the harshness of the church being on the wrong side of history today. I'm speaking about people who are part of the community. I'm speaking about people who are victims of corruption. I'm speaking about young people who are going to study and go into the workspace one day knowing that they have to pay a debt from the IMF that was actually looted during COVID-19 pandemic. They feel the brunt of the church being on the wrong side of history. Christine, from a psychological point of view, someone who's sitting in the pews every Sunday, in the pews of the same church that reminds them every day that they belong but not fully. What do you have to say about this?
I think a mistake we can make is that each person has to do an account in their relationship with God. So each person there's a certain level of accountability. So each Christian needs to have an account to say, this is where I betray Jesus and this is where I follow Jesus. And have to open their hearts to say, what is God calling me to do in terms of justice? Because until we open up that personal accountability door to say, I can't necessarily change the bigger things unless God calls me to that. But I have to be open to what God is calling me to. And it could end up being bigger. But I think the thing is, as a person sitting in the pews might say, I don't have the positioning to worry about, I'm not the IMF. I'm not the International Monetary Fund. I'm not in charge of this institution or that. And it's a negation of accountability. Because I'm just reminded of the story of the boy and the fish and the bread loaves. When the opportunity arises, do you make yourself available to be used by God? And it's not a romantic, it sounds like a sentimental story. But nothing about the Bible is actually sentimental. It's actually a principle to be applied. So it sounds like this amazing sentimental story, or that David took 5 stones and killed Goliath. It sounds all sentimental and impossible. But if you're Christian, you believe those events happened. So for me, it's a principle. If God calls you to give up your 5 loaves and fishes, then that's what he calls you to. If he calls you, like the tax collector, to give up your tax collection, you give up your whole tax collection. So I think it is about saying, am I in relationship with God, asking God what injustices, whether they're small or whether they're huge, is he calling me to address? And until each South African says, I take the Bible literally in terms of it's happened. Those events were real people, and they're principles which I can use to apply in my life now. If God calls me to address gender-based violence, then that's what I do. If God calls me to address poverty, then that's what I do. And then God can call groups of people together. But he does start also with the individual. I don't think we can wait until we say it's up to the institutional church to set up a commission to spend the next 5 years debating the issue. I think people need to say proactivity starts with me. And then, of course, we can set up groups that can give leverage. But this idea of waiting for big things to happen, if I look at the Bible, it can be one person making the first move, which encourages the actual miracle. And I think that's where it comes in. It's not us doing it, it's God doing it through us. So this idea of saying we must wait for the church to have power, that's incorrect. God works through us, it's his power. As Christians, we believe that. So it's about saying, if I'm waiting to get the authority in my human strength, I think we've missed the gospel.
I think for me, you put it well. As if you are saying, the church has to be intentional now.
Yeah.
Whether we want to be on the right side or on the wrong side, the church has to make a choice. The church cannot continue to be undecided. For me to respond, to say practically, how then do we do that? When you look at the Kairos document, which was done in 1985, in response to, I think, state of emergency during apartheid, there are 3 things that are raised there. It says the church, it needs to read the signs of times. What's happening around us now. Number 2, the church, it needs to interpret the signs of times. Then if we know what's happening around us, how then do we analyze and interpret what's happening around us? And then thirdly, the church needs to respond to the signs of times around us. Now what's happening, we are facing the issues of corruption. We are facing the issues of racial disparities or whatever, or segregation. We are facing the issues of sexuality, human sexuality. We are facing the issues of unemployment and poverty in our country. We are facing the issues, so many issues that we are facing in our country. Now as the church, it is up to us now to read those signs of times and interpret them and respond to them. Maybe, let me say this, around the area of Glenferness, I always ask myself a question. I wonder, people of Lone Hill, Glenferness, what would, if Gracepoint can bend down, remember it for? Will they remember for the funerals that were hosted in Gracepoint? Will they remember for the weddings that were hosted in Gracepoint? Or they will remember Gracepoint as a place where gays and lesbians were all welcomed. Blacks and whites and Indians were all welcomed. Poor and wealthy were all welcomed. The hungry were fed. The marginalized were embraced. Will it be remembered as a place that overflowed with justice, righteousness for all people? So as the church, we need to be intentional. John Speckman, in his book, about community development. He says the way that the church needs to do community development, it is people-centered development. You don't tell people this is what you need, but you listen and ask people, what is it that you need? Then by so doing, you are helping them to understand where are they and where do they want to move. So justice it is not the church that needs to determine what is justice, but people has to determine what is justice according to me.
Christine Aidle, thank you for an absolutely incredible conversation. You've given us so much to think on, and I think there would be no way for me to summarize this conversation because there has been so much that has come out of this that is so valuable. And it's definitely something I look forward to coming back and listening to again, and just being able to also sit at your feet and listen to the wisdom that you've both brought from your respective fields. So thank you so, so very much. And then to everyone at home, thank you for joining us for tonight's conversation. It was really wonderful. I hope you enjoyed it just as much as we did. And I just want to invite you to continue with us this conversation for our Tuesday night chats this coming week at 7 o'clock. We hope we'll see you there. Thanks so much.